Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the final part of myself covering Spengler's political essays. So let's just bring up the document. Yeah, we've mostly gone through the longer essays in the book, and we're going to be going through the last of the longer ones that are in here. So we're going to be looking at first one's called Nietzsche and His Century. So it's very important because Nietzsche would be one of Spengler's main intellectual influences. Okay, so this one's slightly shorter than the others, but it's longer than a lot of the others. So, speech given on the 15th of October 1924, Nietzsche's 80th birthday at the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar. Anyone who looks back on the 19th century today and lets its great men pass by will find something astonishing in Nietzsche's appearance, something that his own time could hardly have felt. All the others, including Wagner, Strindberg, and Tolstoy, somehow wore the colour and form of those years, somehow clung to their platitudinous optimism of their progress Philistines, their utilitarian and social ethics, their world picture of power and substance, and conformity and expediency, and made sacrifice after sacrifice to the spirit of the age. Only one person makes a ruthless exception to this, and if the word untimely, which he himself coined, can still be applied to anyone today, then it was Nietzsche himself, for one will search in vain in his entire life and the entire attitude of his thought for something in which he would have inwardly succumbed to a fashion. He thus stands in contrast and yet again in a deep kinship with the second German of recent times, whose life has been a great symbol, Goethe. Also important because that was Spengler's other main intellectual influence, along with Nietzsche. These are the only two Germans of distinction whose existence has depth outside and alongside their works, and because both felt this way themselves from the very beginning and constantly gave an account of it, has become the common property of their nation and an essential part of its intellectual history. But it was actually, I'm going to zoom in a bit for people because that might have been a bit far away. But it was Goethe's good fortune that he was born at the height of Western culture in the midst of a mature and saturated spirituality, which he represented, and that he needed nothing more than to be entirely the man of his time in order to achieve the formal serenity that was meant when he was later called the Olympian. Nietzsche lived a century later, and in the meantime, the great turning point had occurred, which we only understand today. It was his doom to stand beyond the Rococo, in the middle of the complete lack of culture of the 60s and 70s. What streets and houses he had to live in, what manners, clothes, and furniture he had to see around him, in what forms did social intercourse move at that time? How did one think? How did one write? How did one feel? Goethe lived in a time full of form. Nietzsche passed away with longing for forms that were irrevocably broken and gone, just as the one had only to affirm what he saw and experienced. So the other had nothing left but a passionate protest against all that was present if he wanted to save within himself what was still active in him as a cultural heritage from his ancestors. Throughout their lives, they both strived for a strict inner form and mouldedness. But the 18th century was itself in form. It possessed the highest level of society that Western Europe had never ever known. The 19th century had neither a refined society nor any form at all, apart from the casual customs of a metropolitan upper class, in who only here and there a laboriously maintained courtly or bourgeois tradition. And just as Goethe, as a recognised member of society, was able to grasp and solve all the great questions of his time, as Wilhelm Meister and the elective affinities teach us, Nietzsche was only able to fulfil his task in complete detachment from it. His eerie loneliness stands as a symbol of Goethe's cheerful sociability. The one works through what exists, the other broods over what does not exist, in favour of a prevailing form and against a prevailing non-form. But apart from that, form was something very different for them. Nietzsche was the only born musician among the great intellectual Germans. All the others were either visualizers or dissectors, whether they thought, wrote poetry, or painted. He lived, felt, he thought with his ear, he could hardly use his eyes. His prose is heard, almost sung, not written. The vowels and cadences are more important than the comparisons, and so what he felt in the times was their melody, their rhythm. He discovered the key of foreign cultures. No one before him knew anything about the tempo of history. A number of his concepts, the Dionysian, the pathos of distaste, the eternal return, can certainly be understood in musical terms. And just to elaborate on that, Dionysian is a term coined by Nietzsche in his ever first published work, The Birth of Tragedy, something he wrote while he was still a student. It's actually the only work of his I've actually read, funnily enough, and some relatively familiar with the concept. So, according to Nietzsche, there are two strands in art and culture: the Apollonian and the Dionysian, are taken from the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus. Apollonian represents the kind of fully formed physical aspects, while Dionysian is much more abstract and ethereal. Obviously, Apollo is the god of the sun. Dionysus is the god of wine and merriment. So there's a kind of heroic sort of strength and structure to the Apollonian, where Dionysian is much more chaotic. And so when we're talking about art, so sculpture is Apollonian, where something like music is the most Dionysian form of art, to give an example of that. He felt the rhythm in what was called nobility, custom, heroism, nobility, gentlemanly morality. His first experience the rhythmic sequence of ages, customs, and ways of thinking, races, and great individuals, like a symphony in the historical picture that scholarly research had built up from dates and figures at the time. And he himself had music, the way he walked, spoke, dressed, felt other people, the way he formed problems and drew conclusions. What was education for Goethe was rhythm for him. In the broadest sense, social and moral, historical, linguistic rhythm, honed by deprivation in the time that had little of it. Tasso, like Zarathustra, was born out of suffering, but Tasso, in his sense of weakness, passed away before a presence that he loved and saw high above him. Zarathustra despises his present and takes refuge in the distant past or future. This not being at home at a time is a German doom. Through the fault of our past, we blossom too late and then too quickly. From Klopstock and Lessing onwards, in barely 80 years, we have had to travel a path for which other nations have had centuries. This is why we did not develop an internalized form of tradition and a society of standing as the guardian of this tradition. We adopted forms, motifs, tasks, and solutions from all sides and struggled with them, while others grew up with them and within them. Next to the beginning was already the end. Kleist discovered as the first Ibsen's traits while he was still trying to appropriate Shakespeare's characteristics. German intellectuality owes this tragedy a dense succession of distinct personalities, when France and England already had only writers, poetry, and thought as a profession, not as fate, but also the fragmentary, unredeemed, excluding the ultimate goals and roundness. Today we can summarize the contrast that emerged everywhere in Western Europe around 1800, including literary St. Petersburg, with the words classicism and romanticism. Goethe is a classicist, and to the same extent that Nietzsche was a romantic, but this only describes the predominant colour of their being. Each of them also possessed the other possibility, which sometimes pushed itself to the fore. And just as Goethe, whose Faust monologues and West Eastern Divan are highlights of romantic world feeling, always endeavoured to master this inclination towards the distant and boundless and to subordinate it to a clear and strict traditional form. So Nietzsche, at least in his evaluations, but his acquired inclination towards the classically sensible, to which he was doubly close as a temperament and as a philologist, behind what he called Dionysian. They were both on the borderline. Goethe was the last classicist, just as Nietzsche was the last romantic alongside Wagner. They exhausted the circle of these possibilities by living and shaping. After them, the meaning of the times could no longer be captured in words and images, as the apogenies of classical drama and the successors of Zarathustra and the Ring of the Nibelungs proved. But it is equally impossible to develop a new way of seeing and saying like them, no matter how strong designers may emerge in Germany. As individuals and beautiful coincidences, that even the great line of development has come to an end, they will always stand in the shadow of these two. It is part of the essence of Western classicism that it clings entirely to the present and seeks to dissolve the past and future in it, while mastering opposing instincts. Indeed, that's something Spengler would elaborate on in Decline of the West. His idea of the Apollonian or the classical civilization is a civilization that lives entirely in its own present, in the here and now. It has no concrete sense of what is past or future. And just to address a comment from Lord Charles Thomas in the chat, hence why it describes classical civilization as Apollonian, as sculpture was its primary art form, the way music is Faustian civilization. Yes, thank you very much for that comment, Lord Charles Thomas. Yeah, and indeed, that's where he gets the terms from. So Apollonian for classical, and what's also interesting is Spengler in Decline of the West, because when Nietzsche conceives of Apollonian versus Dionysian, from Nietzsche, he swaps out a Dionysian for Faustian, and that's what he gives to the West, Faustian man. So he's sort of adapting Nietzsche's this sort of dialectic between the two forms with this inspiration from Goethe in his own work. Okay. It is part of the essence of Western classicism that it clings entirely to the present and seeks to dissolve the past and future in it, while mastering opposing instincts. Goethe's expression of the demand of the day, his cheerful present, mean that he drew every kind of past. His Greeks, his Renaissance, even Götz and Faust and Egmont to himself in order to incorporate them completely into the spirit of proximity, so that in the case of Tasso and Iphigenia, not even the thought of historical documents occurs to us. Conversely, distance is the true homeland of all romantics. They all yearn from the present for that which is far away and foreign, into the past and the future of history. None of them has ever been able to find a deep relationship with that which surrounded them. The romantic is attached by what is alien to his nature, the classicist by what is in keeping with his nature. Noble dreamers and noble repressors of dreams. This is how some romanticize the conquerors, rebels, and criminals of the past or ideal states, future empires and supermen, while others understood or practiced statecraft as a practice and method, such as Goethe and Humboldt. The dialogue between Egmont and Orange is one of Goethe's masterpieces. He loved Napoleon as an apparition, as he saw him working nearby. He never knew what to do with the violent men of the past as soon as he had to visualize them. His Caesar remained unwritten, but Nietzsche only loved people of this type from a distance, like Bismarck. He could not bear to be near them, nor could he have tolerated Napoleon. He would have seemed crude, empty, and flat to him. Like the Napoleonic natures who lived around him, the great politicians of Europe and the men of power and business, whom he did not even see, let alone understand. He needed a wide distance between the once and now in order to feel a kinship with reality, and that is why he created the Superman and hardly less freely the form of Cesare Borgia. These two tendencies run tragically through recent German history. Bismarck was a classicist of politics. He only reckoned with what was there, with things he saw and could move. And that is why the patriotic enthusiasts neither loved nor understood him until his work was complete, and he could be romanticized as an almost mythical figure, the odd man in the Sachsenwald. But Ludwig II, who was ruined by his romanticism, never created or could have created anything that promised permanence, found this love without respecting it, not only among the people, but among thinkers and artists who could have seen more clearly. Kleist is at best held in shy esteem among us, which is tantamount to rejection, precisely where he succeeded in conquering the romantic in himself. He is inwardly infinitely distant to most people, in contrast to Nietzsche, whose design and fate is nevertheless close to that of the Bavarian king, who is revered even by those who have never read him. His aristocratic taste, which is solitary and rapturous through and through, can now also be explained by his penchant for faraway places. The incipient classicism of the 18th century, which originated on the Thames and was transferred from there to the mainland, just as the Ossianic romanticism originating in Scotland, cannot be separated from the rationalism of the same period. It designs consciously and deliberately. It replaces free imagination with knowledge, even with erudition, the understood Greeks, the understood Renaissance, and therefore finally also the understood active environment. These English classicists, who were all of a class, helped to create liberalism as a worldview as the 18th century understood it, as Frederick the Great understood it, the rejection of differences that one felt certain in practice anyway, the sensible response to facts of public opinion that could be stripped of danger by either eliminated nor concealed. English democracy emerged from the classicism of a noble society, a superior tactic, not a doctrinaire program. It's based on the long and deep experience of a class that was accustomed to reckoning and dealing with the real and the possible, which therefore never ran the risk of making itself mean instead of being affable. It's interesting because if you read Prussian Socialism, Spengler elaborates a lot more on his views on the English political system, distinguishing it from the German, that English hierarchy is passed through the idea of class, whereas in Germany, or Prussia rather, it's distinguished by that of rank. So therefore, it's all about, are you upper class or middle class? Where in Prussia, it's all about, are you a nobleman or a commoner? Are you in the army or not, etc. Goethe, who was also aware of his social standing, was never an aristocrat in the passionately theoretical sense of Nietzsche, who did not have the habit of practical experience at close quarters. Finally, he never really got to know the democracy of his time in its power and impotence. If he rebelled against herd mentality, with the fury of an emotionally sensitive person, the reason for this came from some historical past. It was no doubt the first to see, in its implacable form, how in all the great civilizations and epochs of the past, The multitude is nothing how it suffers history, but does not make it how it is the constant victim and object to the personal will of individuals and classes born to rule. This was felt often enough, but apart from him. This feeling was also not able to destroy the traditional image of humanity, whose course of development seemed to be the progressive solution of an ideal task, and whose leaders seemed to be the representatives of this task. Here lies the immeasurable difference between the historiography of Niebuhr and Ranke, which as an idea was also of romantic origin, and his way of looking at history. His gaze, which was penetrated into the soul of the times and peoples, overcame the mere pragmatic ordering of facts, but this view required distance. English classicism, which also produced the first modern historian of the Greeks in Grote, a merchant and practical politician, was definitely that of a select society. These Greeks were ennobled by being perceived as their equals, by visualizing them in the truest sense of the word, as cultivated, distinguished, intellectually refined people who did everything they did with taste, including Homer and Pindar, whom English classical philology was the first to refer to Horace and Virgil. From English society, this classicism penetrated into what could only correspond to it in Germany, to the small courts, whose prince educators and preachers were the mediators, and the courtly circle of Weimar was ultimately the world within which Goethe's life became the symbol of a serene closeness and rounded presence, a convivial house that formed the centre of intellectual Germany, a fulfilment that can be seen in no other German poet's life, a harmony of rising, maturing, and fading that is a classical in a specifically German sense. Alongside this career stands the other, which also came to an end in Weimar, starting from the confines of a Protestant parsonage, from which a large, and perhaps the largest part of German spirituality originated, to the sun-drenched solitude of the Engadin. There is no other German who has lived so passionately as a private man, away from everything that is public and social, although they all have the inclination to do so, even if they are public people. In the final analysis, his rapturous longing for friends was only his inability to really live in a company, a more spiritual way of being lonely. Instead of the friendly Goethe house on the Frauenplan, the small cheerless house in Silsmaria, the solitude of the mountains, the solitude of the sea, and finally the lonely extinction in Turin. And it's the purest romantic life course that the 19th century has offered us. Nevertheless, his need to communicate was stronger than he himself believed, and certainly far stronger than that of Goethe, who, despite all his affability, was one of the most secretive people. His elective affinities are a closed book, say nothing of the Wanderjahr and the Second Fausta. His most profound poems are soliloquies. Nietzsche's aphorisms never are, nor are the Nachtlied, nor are the Dionysius dithyrambs. An invisible witness is always present whose eye rests on him, yet in this he has remained a Protestant and a believer in God. All these romantics lived in circles and schools. He invented something like this by turning his friends into equal listeners, or by creating a circle of companions in the distant past and future in order to lament his loneliness to them, again like Novalis and Hölderlin. His whole life is filled with the bliss and agony of renunciation, and with the desire to surrender and conquer himself, to tie his life somewhere and in some way to something that was not in keeping with his nature. But this is how his view of the soul of times and cultures develops, which did not reveal its secrets to a classical self-assured man. I think ultimately where Spengler's coming from here is that when you're contrasting Goethe and Nietzsche, Goethe, as was a man of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, who was born during the age of Romanticism, which I can see a lot of Romanticist thinking in Spengler's thought overall. That's this sort of longing, idealistic melancholy for the glory of the past. And fundamentally, it's almost like Spengler sees Romanticism and Goethe as like the last gasp of the old spirit and energy of Europe or the West, and that by the time Nietzsche comes along, it's in the latter half of the 19th century. Everything's become, very industrial and bourgeois, and ultimately modernity is there in full. We're in the winter of civilization, and so Nietzsche is almost like this brooding loner, a little bit like Spengler himself, funnily enough, who's just lamenting the sign of the times that they're in ultimately. The organic pessimism of his existence now explains the works and the order in which they emerged. We who are already far removed from the heyday of materialism should always marvel at what a deed it was for someone to write a book like The Birth of Tragedy at this age and at this state of science in 1870. The famous formula of Apollo and Dionysus contains much more than the average person even realizes even today. The most important thing was not that he discovered an inner dichotomy in classical Greece, which everyone else, with the exception of Buckingham and Burckhardt, was the purest revelation of the universally human, but that he already possessed the superiority of wisdom to see inside entire cultures and living individuals. One need only read Mommsen and Curtius in comparison. The others understood Greekness to be merely a sum of states and events that took place within a time and space. Today's way of seeing history owes only its origin, not its depth to romanticism. At that time, it was nothing but applied philology when it dealt with the Greeks and Romans, nothing but applied archival research when it dealt with Western peoples. It developed the view that history began with the written tradition. Liberation came from the spirit of music. The musician Nietzsche developed the art of emphasizing with the style and rhythm of foreign cultures, beyond and often in contradiction to the sources. But what does it matter? With the word Dionysus, Nietzsche discovered what the excavations finally revealed 30 years later, the underworld and undersoul of ancient civilization, and thus the soulfulness itself that lies behind the great history. The description of history had become the psychology of history. The 18th century and classicism, including Goethe, believed in the culture, the one true moral spiritual culture, as the task of one humanity. From the very beginning, Nietzsche speaks as a matter of course of cultures as a spectacles of nature that simply began at some point, without task, reason, purpose, and reason, or whatever else the all too human interpretations might be. Once because the fact that all these cultures, truths, ways of thinking, art belong to a kind and form of existence that emerges and then disappears again forever, stated with such clarity for the first time in this book. The fact that every historical fact is the expression of a stirring of the soul, that cultures, ages, classes, races have a soul like individual human beings, was such a tremendous step forward in deepening of history that even he himself did not overlook its significance at the time. Just some more comments from Lord Charles Thomas. Metternich embodied this in the political arena on the continent, at least. I take it you're referring to the idea of a classicist realism, Lord Charles Thomas. The last great effort on the part of the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians to uphold the previous order. Yes, the Holy Alliance, as it were. Right. So, the 18th century and classicism, including Goethe, believe. Hang on. Right, this next page. Sorry. And yet it is, again, part of the romantic's longing to escape his own nature, on the other hand, and the doom of being born in this period. On the other, that with his second book, Human, All Too Human, he forced himself to serve as a herald of the flattest realism. These were the years in which Western rationalism ended as a farce, after it had begun with greatness under Rousseau, Voltaire, and Lessing. Darwin's doctrine and the belief in force and matter became the religion of the cities. The soul was a chemical process in the protein, and the purpose of the world was gathered in a social epic of enlightened Philistines. Nietzsche was not close to these things with any fibre of his being. He had already given vent to his disgust in the first untimely meditation. Sorry, that should be mediation. But the scholar in him envied Chamfort and Vauvenargues, argues, and the light and somewhat cynical way of dealing with serious things in the tone of the great world, the artist and enthusiast was embarrassed by the massive sobriety of, say, a Düring, which he considered greatness, and as the thoroughly priestly man that he was, more Christian than his time and more Christian than any church. He said about exposing religion as prejudice. Now the purpose of life was knowledge, and the goal of history was the development of intelligence. He said this because it hurt him in a mocking form with which he castigated his passion, and with the unfillable desire to receive from the middle of time a seductive image of the future that was in contrast to the one he was born with. Although the expediency of Darwinism was as far removed from him as possible, he nevertheless extracted secrets from it of which no true Darwinist had an inkling. In the dawn and joyful science, alongside a way of seeing things that should be prosaic, even contemptuous, a never shy, reverential one emerges very quietly, which penetrates deeper than ever that of a mere realist, who before him has spoken of the soul of an age, a class, a profession, the priest, the hero, the man, the woman, as he did, who has summarized the psychology of entire centuries in enormous metaphysical formula, who in this story, instead of the facts or eternal truths, represented the types of heroic, tolerant, observant, strong, thick life as the actual substance of the events. This was a completely new kind of living form that only a born musician with the sense of rhythm and melody could find, and now, beyond the physiognomy of historical times, of which he is and will remain the creator, it draws on the horizon of his vision the powerful symbols of the future that he needed to be completely purified from the dross of the thinking present. in a sublime hour the image of the eternal return, as German mystics in Gothic times, for example, had imagined it. A circling in the infinite, in the night of immeasurable times, a way of losing his soul completely in the mysterious depths of the universe, regardless of whether these things can be justified scientifically or not. And in the midst of this vision, though the Superman and his herald, Zarathustra, as the embodied sense of the short-breathed human history of the earthly star in which he himself dwelt. All three designs from a perfect distance, which can nowhere be related to the present, which for this very reason touch every German soul enigmatically. But there is in a corner in each of them where ideals of the peoples and dreams of the future with a more beautiful humanity lie dormant. Goethe hardly needed it. That's why he couldn't really become popular. This was what people missed about him, which is why he was called cold and frivolous. We will never completely free ourselves from this tendency. It represents in us the unlived part of the great past. Having reached this height, Nietzsche posed the question of the value of the world, which had been in him since childhood. This marked the end of the period of Western philosophy that had centered on the question of the form of knowledge. Here too there was a classicist and romantic, or put it in contemporary terms, a social and an aristocratic answer. Life is worth as much as it benefits the whole. That was the answer of the educated English who had learnt at Oxford to distinguish between one put forward as an honourable opinion and one deeded at decisive moments as a politician or businessman. Life is all the more valuable the stronger its instincts are. That was the answer of Nietzsche, whose own life was tender and easily vulnerable. Nevertheless, because he was far removed from this active life, he understood its secret, that the will to power is stronger than all principles and doctrines, that it has always made history and will do so in the future, whatever one may prove or preach against it. This is the final comprehension of real history. It is indifferent to the conceptual dissection of the will. The image of the active, creating and destroying will in history is everything to him. The concept has become the aspect. It does not teach, he states. So it was and so it will be, and even if theoretical and priestly men live otherwise 1,000 times, the primal instincts of life will remain the stronger ones. Well, the distance between Schopenhauer's world picture and this one, between Nietzsche's contemporaries with their sentimental plans to improve the world and this realization of a hard fact, the fact that he succeeded in doing so places this last romantic thinker at the top of this century. Here we are all his disciples, whether we like it or not, whether we know him or not. This view has already conquered the world. Nobody writes history anymore without seeing things in this way. And since life had thus been judged by the facts as the only yardstick, and the facts taught that the stronger or weaker will to prevail makes life valuable or worthless, that goodness and success are almost mutually exclusive, his world picture culminates in the magnificent critique of morality, in which he does not preach morality, but measures the morals that have emerged historically by their success, not by any true morality. This was indeed a revaluation of all values, and even if we know today that he misconceived the contrast between Master morality and Christian morality as a result of his personal suffering in the 1880s. Behind the lies, the ultimate contrast in human existence, which he sensed and sought and believed he had finally grasped in this formula. If we replace master morality with the instinctive life practice of the person determined to take action, if we replace Christian morality with the theoretical judgment of contemplative natures, then we have before us the tragedy of man in general, whose predominant types will always misunderstand each other, always fight each other, always suffer from each other. Deed and thought, reality and ideal, success and redemption, strength and goodness, these are the powers that will never understand each other. But in historical reality, it is not the ideal, goodness and morality that reign. Their kingdom is not of this world, but determination, energy, presence of mind, practical talent, complaints and moral judgments will not abolish the fact. Such is man, such is life, such is history. Precisely because all action was so far removed from him and he only knew how to think, he understood the underpinnings of action better than any great deed in the world. And the more he understood, the more shyly he withdrew from contact with it. Thus, his romantic destiny came to fulfillment. Under the force of these last insights, the last part of his life is formed in the strictest contrast to that of Goethe, who was no stranger to action, but understood his real destiny as a poet and serenely limited himself. Goethe, the privy councillor and minister, the celebrated centre of European spirituality, was nevertheless able to confess in the last year of his life, in the last act of his Faust, that regarded his life as fulfilled. Linger thou art so beautiful. Word of blissful satisfaction, spoken at the moment when the work of active closeness is completed under Faust's command, to last from now on. That was the great and final symbol of the classicism to which this life was dedicated, and which led from the controlled education of the 18th century to controlled ability of the 19th. But the distance cannot be created, only proclaimed. And just as Faust's death concluded the classical course of life, So now the spirit of the loneliest of all wanderers sprays out with a final curse on his time in these enigmatic days of Turin, when he saw the last mists fading in the image of his world, and the most distant peaks clearly emerging. And it's precisely for this reason that Nietzsche existence had a stronger effect on posterity. The fulfillment of Goethe's life also means that it concluded something. Countless Germans will honour Goethe, live with him, rise up to him, but it will not transform them. Nietzsche's effect is transformative because the melody of his vision never came to an end in himself. Romantic thought is infinite, sometimes in form, never conclusive in thought. It always grasps new areas, consumes them or melts them. Its way of seeing goes on to friends and enemies, and from them to ever new successors or opponents. Even if one day no one reads the works anymore, this gaze will last and be creative. Nietzsche's work is not a piece of the past to be savoured, but a task to be served. Today it depends neither on his writings nor on the subject matter, and that is precisely why it is a question of German destiny. If we do not learn to act as real history means in the midst of a time that does not tolerate unworldly ideals and takes revenge on their originators, in which the hard doing that Nietzsche baptized Cesare Borgia's name alone as validity, in which the morality of ideologues and do-gooders is limited even more ruthlessly than usual to superfluous and ineffective talking and writing, then we will cease to be a people. We cannot live without the wisdom of life that does not comfort us in bad situations, that helps us out of the and wisdom appears in its rigour when the German fought for the first time in Nietzsche. However much it may be disguised by impressions and thoughts that came to him from other sources, he's shown history as it is to be the most history-hungry people in the world. His legacy is the task of a living history in this way. Again, so very interesting essay by Spengler. I really like it when writers go over their intellectual influences, because Spengler does talk about it to an extent in Decline of the West, but I think in this essay, the first time he really dives into his own thoughts and assessments on the work of Goethe and Nietzsche. Right. Okay. So we're going to skip over the next one, which is France and Europe, because that's a shorter one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the next or the last of the longer ones in this collection called On the Present Relationship Between the World Economy and World Politics. Because other than that, all the other essays in this book are all shorter. They're all 7 pages or less. And so, I think just giving people encouragement to actually buy it themselves and perhaps read it and, so I don't spoil everything for you. So, lecture held on the 9th of November 1926 at the Industria Club in Dusseldorf. And again, people remember the last sort of couple of chapters of the second volume of Decline. Spengler has these couple of chapters on the finance and money power, which are very profound segments of Decline that people such as Morgoth have elaborated on his channel. And Spengler's going to do some more delving in this chapter. Although Germany, which under Bismarck was to a large extent the subject and centre of world political decisions, is today dependent on the decisions of foreign powers to an extent that has never been the case with a large country since Napoleon, and indeed economically no less than militarily. And politically, there are nevertheless serious questions of an economic nature that must be posed correctly for Germany and by the German economic leadership itself, so that correct solutions are possible at all. It is fate when such responsibility is imposed on individuals, and they must know that the fate of larger units of life lies in their hands, depends on their way of seeing and dealing with things, and that it is their damn duty to see and act correctly. Those who take the wrong view of major problems will only achieve disastrous results in practice, and I have long seen this danger coming for the German economy. I've said again and again that politics and economics are different areas of human life, thought and action, but that they cannot be separated from each other as sides of the same life, that politics is absolutely the first, and that every economic life must perish without proper political leadership of the country. Again, this is something that Friedrich List talks about in the National System of Political Economy. Proper political, because again, economy or economics as a whole is often shortened for this older expression of political economy, and what List expands upon is the idea that economics is an extension of politics, and that he's very critical of people like Adam Smith or David Ricardo, these classical liberals, because they are not practicing political economy. They're practicing a kind of, cosmopolitan, international economic trade zone. The political economy means serving the political state or nation in which you'll find yourself living in or in control of. This is what the pride of the economic leader will not accept. He is too inclined to reject the politician's preoccupation of his actions as overzealous presumption and damage, but to immediately call upon politics for help if, and as long as he believes, he can use it to further his interests. He wishes to give it the form and direction that seems appropriate to him at the moment. Even if this is the rule throughout the world today, it is pretty shallow and wrong, and it becomes fatal when politics itself is weak and sick, without its own goals and without pride, and is thus subject to the random, short-sighted interventions of the economy. The economic life of a nation always needs a superior, not a compliant subordinate policy. The fact that it is the other way round throughout the world today is one of the reasons why neither the one or the other can be managed properly and safely. It is therefore necessary to recognise the close relationship between the great powers of politics and economics, which changes continuously and inevitably with the historical epochs as it exists today, and as it will probably continue to change in a certain direction in the coming decades. The era of major global political combinations with an economic background from the second half of the last century has not come to an end. On the contrary, they have left one form to strive for a new and different one, and we are in the midst of this development. Without a relationship to and support from foreign policy, there is no economic power, perhaps no economic opportunity, nor is it possible to formulate even the slightest national political goal without taking economic necessities into account. When I talk about the relationship between world economy and world politics, I am fully aware that just a few decades ago, this interdependence was sometimes underestimated and sometimes not even recognized. It was not so long ago that the major economies of leading industrialized countries regarded the preoccupation of politics with them as an undesirable intervention by laymen, that the preoccupation of the economist himself with politics was regarded in his circles almost as an objection against him, as proof of vanity and dilettantism, and that in any case it was believed that economic tactics could be pursued on a grand scale, disregarding the purely political factors that were playing their diplomatic game at the same time. Therefore, the close connection between the two areas of power must be understood for many years in the past and for many years in the near future. Not only has the economy itself changed fundamentally in its internal form, not only world politics as such in terms of its aims, forms, and means of power, but above all the relationship between the two. Indeed, one of the first reasons for the disaster since 1914 has been that this relationship has been reversed in comparison with the situation that existed at the time of Bismarck's beginnings. When I talk about the present relationship between politics and business, I am not referring to this year or the next few years. It is a serious mistake for the economy to think only until the next balance sheet in this respect. A crisis that can be overcome in the course of a few years has not been a crisis at all, but an insignificant embarrassment. And people are mistaken about the severity of the crisis, which is just beginning, not already ending. The major problems posed by the global economy in the course of its development are of a secular nature. They need decades to develop and decades not to arrive at a solution, but to arrive at an organic form from which new problems then arise. All the major issues that are ailing the global economy today were there before the war. There's nothing that has really emerged anew since then. They've been reshaped, shifted, and aggravated by the war and by the effects of the war, but they will never be understood in their deepest essence if we do not realize how old they really are. In short, it is a question of the fact that in the course of the 19th century, the peoples of Western Europe, the white race, as one can also say, came to organize their political and economic existence in a way that could no longer be maintained in this form towards the end of the 19th century. We are the heirs of this century and have to bear and overcome its consequences. Lord Charles Thomas, this was 1926, if I recall. Yes, 1926. Yeah, so most of these essays are in the 1920s. Everything that happens in history does not take place between interest groups, nor between individuals, but between the large living organisms that we call states, i.e. politically organized peoples. This also applies to the economy. It must be realized that from one century to the next, the greatest questions and tendencies of economic development presuppose the existence of organized bodies of peoples and states, each of which is at the same time an economic body. The world economy is the sum of what takes place in these bodies, initially in each of them separately. It is a very loose structure of many economic units, and in the future, as always, it will lead to the most serious economic psychological misconceptions. If anyone should believe that the world economy can be treated as an individual that leads a unified inner and outer life, not only are we very far from it, but we will never get there. The world economy has always consisted and will always consist of a number of national economies, and the history of the world economy will largely consist of the moods and events that develop between these bodies as a result of their strong independent existence. but these bodies themselves, which have led or suffered the fate of the economy in the course of the last decades, were essentially created in the Napoleonic period. When the political form of the white states, including Russia, as distinct from the states of the non-European continents, had reached a certain degree of consolidation with the Congress of Vienna, this structure differed from the system of the 18th century, and that the entities of dynastic formation had become nation-states, de facto or in the making. As is well known, Germany and Italy first had to fight for this form. It was created in 1815, and if, on the other hand, a great power like Austria fell into dissolution in the course of the 19th century, it was because its form was not and could not be that of a national state. This is of infinite importance in so much as for a whole century the nation-states, i.e., geographically circumscribed national associations with a uniform mother tongue, but at the same time the units in which the modern economy developed. To name just a few examples, there would be no major port of Odessa or Trieste if there had not been a Russian and an Austro-Hungarian state. Hamburg would not have been ahead of Lübeck and Bremen if the Elbe region, with the imperial capital of a country of 70 million people, had not been located behind it. The development of large trading cities, industrial centres and transport routes depended crucially on where the borders of the states ran, within which economic life formed a cohesive unit. Since these states existed, the economy of the 19th century, including industry and transport, adapted to these conditions of political geography in such an organic form that the willful destruction and dissolution of such a no longer young economic entity is a catastrophe, as we experienced in the East, that cannot be taken seriously enough. Upper Silesia before the war was a unit that cannot be split into two viable parts by a mere border adjustment, just as Pan-Europe, to use the ridiculous term, cannot be transformed into an economic entity by the abolition of borders. Again, Upper Silesia was the southernmost part of Silesia, which had a significant Polish population that was given over to Poland after the Treaty of Versailles, which Germany reclaimed in World War II, very briefly. The governments of these states, internally very strong, non-partisan and therefore thinking more diplomatically than economically, took little notice of the fact that they were also economic entities initially and for almost the entire course of the 19th century. What we'd today call the Manchester Doctrine, the laissez-aller, was decisive. That is talking about classical liberalism, like laissez-faire capitalism. On the other hand, it was taken for granted that the government had a duty to promote the economy, generally speaking, without this being linked to specific concepts, objectives, and methods. On the other hand, the concept of private enterprise was developed to a degree that has been lost today. In England in particular, but also in the Germany of the first Bismarck era, the independence of the economic development from any political side view was as complete as we can hardly imagine today. I don't quite agree with him, if I'm being honest, because though we believe this idea of laissez-faire, laissez-aller, that, of Britain or any state that adopts that form of economic management is essentially just letting it to run itself. I mean, that's true. But fundamentally, when you look at something like free trade, the businessmen have an influence over politics. Therefore, the politics serves the interest of business. So the politicians, therefore, as Britain did, will enforce global international free trade because they want a market for their domestic manufacturers to export around the world. So even something like free trade, I'd argue, is not completely divorced from politics. Ultimately, it's a question in that system. The politics is subject to the economics, not the other way around. The result was that Napoleon and for the whole century there were a number of great political powers in the world, all of which had white populations in which were at the same time the solely and exclusively authoritative economic units. It is a very significant difference compared to the 18th century, and not a single one of the coloured states came into consideration in the 19th century. Neither Turkey, nor China, and Japan, nor Persia, although Turkey was still a great power to be taken very seriously in the 18th century, also in relation to Europe, the great powers of the white race were completely among themselves during this period. They determined the economic form of the world and its division into giving and receiving circles, without any counter-pressure being exerted from any side, and they have led the political organisation of the world in this century to a certain end. This is the legacy of the past, from which we draw today, and under whose conditions we are placed. If the 20th century, the one in which we live and for which we work, will leave behind these new forms, they are not there at first, and the great crises and catastrophes we experience are the birth pangs of new powers and forms that develop from the old ones, with or against human will, because they are predestined for the upcoming age. In the first half of the last century, an upheaval occurred here that is unparalleled in world history. In a special area of production, it was the emergence of the machine industry on a grand scale. If we could look back with the eye of a historian of the late future on what happened at that time, we lack the distance today to see the enormity of this phenomenon. The picture that would emerge would be of a population that had been moving slowly for almost a millennium, until suddenly, through a kind of explosion, there was a steep upward movement that, as I said, had no equal anywhere in the past. It's very important for the economic consequences that the impetus for this radical upheaval of all economic relations did not come from a practical necessity, or even from practice itself, but from a psychological drive that initially lay entirely outside the economy. The age of great technical inventions had already begun in the 18th century, but back then, when most inventions were the work of scholars whose knowledge was limited to learned circles and theoretical ambition, every invention was never put into practice immediately, and to the same extent as was in the 19th century. This difference was not the result of necessity or the unfulfilled need for a generally more refined way of life, but the result of a theoretical worldview which, looking back today, we can describe as the blind and fanatical belief in the progress of mankind. At the time of Voltaire, progress was understood to mean an enlightenment directed against the church. At the time of the Romantics, a moral humane deepening. At the end of the century, something quite technical. The passionate struggle against nature, its subjection and domination. Napoleon's time brought the Napoleonic tempo and the Napoleonic will to power into this movement. A high ambition, often above material gain, which the economy of earlier centuries completely lacked in this form. For the first time in the course of a few decades, the economy is being reorganized from the outside in a way that has fundamentally changed the image of entire continents, more in a decade than in a millennium. For serious reasons, I would like to make a distinction here between natural and artificial production. Today, it is customary to speak of production and of production crisis in general. However, one should realize that production is no longer something uniform in its innermost essence. There is one kind which has existed in its essence ever since there have been cultivated human beings, and there is another which is a century old and no older. Without it being possible to draw a sharp line, it is nevertheless of decisive importance for everything that moves us today, the natural, agricultural, and artisanal production. The production of the immediate necessities of life, food, clothing, housing, is something that has been preserved through the ages in a self-evident balance of needs and production, whereas industrial production, which arose from a longing for invention by means of the technology of steam, electricity, and chemistry, is something that presupposes the thirst, something that is added, something that must first create its economic necessity. If large-scale industry, in the broader sense, as it only became a dominant fact in the course of the 19th century, may be described as artificial, then this also means that the relationship between labour and the possibility of nourishment for its yield is not as simple and direct as with an old-style craftsman or farmer who lived almost literally from hand to mouth. Here, the cycle from labour to sales to income is much more complex and uncertain, and also takes up much more geographical space. But the most important thing for the decisions of the future is that the natural production should at least be secured against becoming superfluous one day, if only because producers and consumers, considered as a close population, are essentially identical. It cannot even be imagined from a living folkdom, whereas we learnt during the war that the population of entire countries can quickly free itself from the belief in the indispensability of large parts of industrial production when their products are no longer available and return to natural needs. This is extremely important for the risk situation of a country with predominantly large-scale industry. You can't go back from bread and clothing to something simpler, but you can very well go from driving a car to walking again or stay at home, write a letter instead of a telegram, and take a messenger instead of the railway. In any case, in moments of great upheaval, artificial production itself is not completely secure in its existence, not to mention its profitability. Now, one of the first effects of the emergence of industry on the larger scale is the fact that it cannot do without coal in the form that it's still dominant today, to the extent that coal, as the most difficult to transport means of production, attracts the others to itself, so that the political entities of 1815, in which the large coal deposits happen to lie, have become the leading industrial countries of the world through this geological coincidence. One has to realise how Germany would have developed if, by chance, there had been no coal deposits in Upper Silesia, the Ruhr and Saxony. If, on the other hand, coal was available in large quantities in the Mediterranean region, Spain and Italy would have been rich industrialised countries with twice the population, and Germany would essentially be a farming country, as the South is today. the seemingly purely economic fact that coal deposits were distributed differently when the borders of states and peoples developed during the Napoleonic era led to the formation of the great power system that determined the fate of the world between 1870 and the World War, which collapsed with this war, which was also a result of the contradiction between the economic and political situation of the nations. A country like Belgium was given to Holland as a province at the Congress of Vienna because it was too insignificant to attract much attention. Today, the relationship is completely reversed because the coal is on the Belgian side and not on the Dutch side. The decline of the undisputed great powers of the 17th and 18th century, such as Spain and Sweden, is also due to the fact that these countries were unable to keep up with political development because of the lack of coal. I'm going to slightly disagree with him here because I think the reason why Belgium ends up being independent and guaranteed by the great powers is the cultural differences, because ultimately half the country is French speaking, the other half is Flemish or Dutch speaking. And yes, the Netherlands is a Dutch speaking country, but the fact is, Belgium had been a unified political entity for centuries by that point, separate from the rest of the Netherlands, and had also been Catholic. And this is something, if people are interested, Apostolic Majesty did a very interesting stream at the end of last year on Belgian history, the idea of it not being a fake country, and I'd recommend people give that a watch because he really elaborates a lot of this point. And so, yes, there's certainly an economic argument to why Belgium perhaps was not reunited with the Netherlands, but ultimately there are these cultural factors as well, because there was matters of political stability, because nobody wanted, the British didn't want the French or the Germans to get it, but the Prussians or French did not want themselves to have it either. The decline of undisputed... I've read that bit, sorry. Nor should it be overlooked that Germany's steep rise to a world power in and after Bismarck's time only began when the development of German industry started to become the all-dominant event beyond the founding of the Reich. In Western Europe and North America, and only here, a silent struggle for supremacy between the earth and coal has been developing since the middle of the 19th century. At the time of Napoleon, arable land was the only thing that came into consideration, and when people spoke of a rich, fertile country, they meant the fertility of its soil for the farmer, not for the miner. Now, however, when for the first time in the economic history of the whole world, something other than this primitive economy comes into consideration for the political validity of the country, an infinite transformation is taking place in the structure of the great cultural nations, which one has hardly become aware today. In 1801, Ireland has 6, England 9. Today, Ireland has about 4, and England 40 million inhabitants. Around 1800, Germany had 20 million inhabitants in the borders of 1914, less than France. In the areas that lie completely outside the industrial development, the population has not increased significantly since then. The entire remainder of the tripled number is to be put down to the industrial areas and transport centres, and today 1/6 of the German nation sits on German coal alone. The man-breeding effect of coal is the factor which, starting from the economy, has gradually cast its spell over all politics on a grand scale. Since coal was the necessary basis for the development of mass industry, since it needed hands in fantastic numbers, it drew people out of the other areas in ever-increasing numbers, sucked the land dry, and an internal migration of peoples began in all countries of a white population, the extent of which is still not quite clear today. If the white population of the world, because despite the progress of mankind, it is only the white nations that matter, did not amount to much more than 100 million heads around 1800, I am leaving Russia aside because it occupies a special position. And if this figure had grown to over 500 million in 1914, a growth that is also unprecedented in history, then it is a growth exclusively of the coal regions, industrial cities and transport hubs that establish a connection between them. The coloured population of the world has remained at about the same level throughout this century. The overflowing of the white race is the result of the unforeseen economic fact that coal and its utilisation have bred to a degree that is unprecedented. If public health care has become a self-evident duty of all states, if every single human life, whether valuable or inferior, has had to be preserved, prolonged if possible, then there is an underlying feeling, quite unconsciously, that a modern nation in the struggle between the politically organised great powers of Europe needs every single human life, regardless of its quality, only as a number, and its planned enlargement of the national body at any price resulted in an accumulation of people. The development of the type of a mass nation of which Napoleon's time had no idea. When people talked about modern superpowers in 1914, they had in mind a nation whose size had to be estimated in the tens of millions, if it was to be counted at all. This was an order of magnitude that could only be developed through the economic revolution brought about by the machine industry. But on the other hand, this was of immense importance for politics. The meaning and structure of these peoples was substantially changed. The inner unity was lost. At the time of the revolution of 1848, it could still be said that the leading European nations essentially had a harmonious social organisation according to social classes. Whether one calls this bourgeoisie and peasantry or town and country is relatively indifferent. In any case, the countries were generally so populated that this population in natural provinces could be nourished by the provinces themselves and forms an organic unity from landscape to landscape. Now, a type of nation has arisen which differs essentially from this. It may be said that every nation in whose neighbourhoods large industrial districts have developed has since undergone a thoroughly one-sided growth and basically consists of two peoples united by language and state, but not, as in the past, by a uniform outlook on life. For the enormous masses of uprooted white people who have accumulated in the industrialised areas of Europe and latter in North America live differently, feel differently, and think differently from the rest of the untouched classes and areas. This gives rise to a contrast that Marx formulates very clearly, that incorrectly, for the first time, bourgeoisie and proletariat, which since then has increasingly determined party politics in all the countries under consideration, and with party politics also foreign policy, and thus today the course of world politics to an unimaginable degree. The starting point of this astonishing development is, as I have said, the accumulation of coal of inorganic masses which have not grown up, but flocked together. The end product is the fissuring of the nations concerned into two great masses which, from an internal contradiction of attitude and conception of life, find it difficult to understand each other. There was something else too. It was only in the second half of the 19th century that the judgment of a country as a great power, as advanced or backward, as rich or poor, even as cultivated or uncultivated, began to depend more and more on whether or not such industrial areas were located within its borders. We hardly realise this today, and yet it was decisive for the historical development of the following periods. When people spoke of the wealth of a nation in 1800, they meant something very different from what they meant in 1900. The national wealth of a country, as we understand it today, would not exist if we were to exclude industry. Capital is something of a different order of magnitude and of a different size than it was 50 years earlier, because the entire structure of economic production is based on different types of value and measures of value. But just as rich and poor peoples represent a new difference, the world's peoples are gradually breaking down more and more decisively into producing and consuming peoples, namely with regard to industry. Again, the levelling of all man to just this kind of mass, bug man consumer who's got no interest in any other culture or national identity. And since production in the narrow sense, as I mean it here, the artificial is always associated with the stronger capital power, and thus also the stronger political power, the consumer nation has also become the politically weaker nation in the world since Bismarck. Again, something Friedrich List really strongly emphasizes in his national system of political economy. The nation that is condemned to give way due to a lack of financial and military resistance in international entanglements, treaties and wars, there's hardly a series of trading agreements in which this fact does not emerge quite clearly. The existence of industrial and therefore political superiority on the one hand, and the lack of it on the other. I repeat once again, if all the coloured and most of the white countries of the former importance as great powers were eliminated in the course of the 19th century, if the United States, in contrast to the once much more important Latin America, entered the circle to an increasing degree, if Germany took the mighty rise that caused consternation on all sides and drove to defensive moods, then this is always and again based on the fact that this kind of production economy with mass sales in the distance found the necessary basis, namely the deposit of coal only in the few countries. That is, one, the positive side of this development. The danger of this was not originally felt to the extent that it would have been necessary even today. This is because the fundamental factor of the mode of production, which I referred to earlier as artificial, is based on the inversion of supply and demand. It begins with the fact that a great technical invention is made out of theoretical interest, which until then no one could do without because no one suspected it, that this invention is made the basis of a profitable practical process, that only now is a circle of customers sought for the product, that the production in quantity itself again requires an increase in the number of people in the production area, but that the necessity of securing sales in order to feed these people then leads to an ever further refinement of the process, to superior methods, to overcoming competition through greater output, and thus the beginning is reached again. The new technical invention, which now goes the old way again via the accumulation of the number of people, the search for sales, and the forcing of sales. As a result, in the course of the 19th century, a kind of feverish cycle developed in all large-scale economically organised nations. the speed and tension of which increased from one decade to the next. This condition gradually spread from the immediate industrial circles to the entire population. I remind you of the means of advertising, of the great exhibitions, of the almost sporting interest of public opinion in newspapers and demonstrations in every new invention that was made, of the enthusiasm and national pride that every new height and speed record unleashed, something that the 18th century never knew to that extent. It is a serious historical fact that the term progress of mankind had become a buzzword, which was ultimately understood to mean nothing more than the sum of technical achievements, about whose utilization there was no doubt, because they should and had to be utilized in all circumstances. Alongside this fever of records, alongside the frenzy of statistics, there arose the satisfaction with which every country greeted every number of any kind that had not yet been reached by other countries, the number of large cities, blast furnaces, aeroplanes, the length of railways and telegraph wires, the quantity of coal and ore mined. On the other hand, this phenomenon corresponds to a psychological stimulus to consumption, which was inevitable and which also gradually led to an overstretching of the world's economic situation. It is an effect of this overexcitement of needs, of large imaginary needs, of the production of an outward luxury, not developed by mental refinement but taught up, of the civilized peoples and especially of the lower urban classes, that in the end an average standard of living was taken for granted, which could not have been sustained in the long run, even without the war. We must be in no doubt that standard of living, which was considered normal in Germany, for example, for the last 20 years before the war, will never again be attained. It was unnatural and would have demanded of the individual a labour input which he was neither willing nor able to assume on a permanent basis. The same applies, of course, to England and America, not to mention Russia and other countries. It was also a consequence of the necessity to seek a market for the product created outside the industrialized areas under all circumstances that the non-European masses were now approached with the increasingly urgent demand to start production. They went from mere advertising, from supplying, from publicity to political pressure, to the suppression of coloured competition and possibility to war. This has been carried to the point of crime. In India, it's happened that in order to prevent the Indians from supplying themselves with their own woven goods, the farms of men in entire villages were cut off. The opening up of China and the division of Africa with its numerous warlike expeditions are along the same lines. The coloured world was able to absorb this increased flow of supply for decades, but even there, the point had to be reached where saturation was reached. And now the dangerous aspect of this artificial production becomes apparent. Every country that has essentially remained in the forms of natural production, such as Scandinavia or Italy, will be able to endure a sales crisis by basically being able to feed itself despite it. The masses of people, however, who have accumulated on the back of coal depend to the death on the possibility of receiving an equivalent value from afar for almost the entire product of their hands on which they can feed themselves. Just as sales gradually became long-distance sales over the decades, so the procurement of food gradually became long-distance feeding, and so the establishment of a dense transport system for sales on the one hand and for the supply of raw materials and food on the other became a sine qua non in order to keep these millions of people alive in densely populated areas. The natural peoples had become artificial ones. This is the economic side of the development. It was inevitable that the cycle of facts would exert increasing pressure on the style, methods, and intentions of major politics. This is what has happened over the decades, but it is astonishing how slowly this came about and how little the statesmen of the leading nations foresaw the ultimate result of this development. The first is the fact that politics had to begin to treat the other continents as something extraordinarily important. This hardly happened in Napoleon's time. Africa was a highly indifferent part of the world, and China a model for costume parties. Now, however, the industrialized nations began a race for political power over territories that could no longer be dispensed with as suppliers of raw materials and buyers of industrial products. The purely political idea of the state in the middle of the 19th century was initially only supported by the fact that large-scale industry in the country promoted wealth, the nature of people, and thus also the possibility of raising military and financial means of power. Coal serves the cannons serve historical tradition. The nature of armies in the millions, compared with the hundreds of thousands of 1815, is only possible because of the new scale of everything that was called national wealth, military power, and armaments requirements. But here too, the same reversal occurred as in the relationship between supply and demand. Towards the end of the century, politics lost the lead in the relationship between the economy and politics. Originally, it was coal, industry, and its products that gave the armies and thus the politics of the great states the means of power. So essentially, we've moved from what you could say is a resource-based economy to a finance or money-based economy. And it could also explain why in most Western countries today, a lot of industry has been completely shuttered off to the third world, or is in the process of doing so, especially in Germany and in America. But hopefully, as Trump's back in with a lot of his actions, especially his recent talk on tariffs, he's hopefully going to reverse that. Now, as the dark feeling that these documents are not unshakable under all circumstances takes hold, politics are slowly and imperceptibly beginning to be mastered by economic management. The cannons now serve coal. The complete dependence on economic necessities existed around 1910. It was only realised in its full extent in the course of the World War. Economic imperialism, and only in its service political imperialism, that is the word for this new type of policy, has the task of securing the existence of a mass people to the outside world, a people that cannot feed itself within its own borders after its numbers have swelled far beyond these possibilities as a result of industrialization. The policies of colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence, the opening up of China, the penetration of tropical America, the famous place in the sun, the division of Africa into areas of exploitation, the waging of a whole series of wars against the Boers in Egypt and Morocco, in China, Burma, and Madagascar, on the borders of India and Turkestan, in order to reserve economic opportunities for a single power alone. The result of this early period of imperialism was that individual great powers, world powers, crystallized out the number of middle powers because they had to pursue some form of imperialist policy, because to do without it would have meant the economic ruin of millions of their own nationals. Imperialism, which consisted in the growing armament and readiness for war of the world powers in order to remain in the ranks of these nations, a first rank, and to be able to exert pressure on the militarily weaker ones in all negotiations, even purely economic ones, has finally been driven forward to the catastrophe which the outbreak of World War represents. The high tension has long since been reached. If one looks at things from an economic point of view, the point at which the saturation of the entire world market with products had come dangerously close was reached by 1900 and 1910. Even then, warning voices were raised, advising the timely initiation of negotiations on quotas and the joint inhibition of increased production. With historical facts that are stronger than human beings, it goes without saying that such considerations had to remain unsuccessful. No one in a position of responsibility will be in a position to voluntarily renounce a power conferred on his country and the advantages associated with it in order to grant an advantage to another country. In any case, the competitive need of the leading countries, all of which were industrialized and also colonial and imperialist countries, was already close to unloading at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. If it was still avoided at that time, and if the oversaturation of the market with means of production was not yet so glaringly apparent, we owe this exclusively to the fact that from the end of this war to the outbreak of the World War, such a gearing up for this final decision took place that the mere provision of war requirements for armies on an unimagined scale was sufficient to essentially protect industry from sales worries for a full decade, and unfortunately to blind it to the facts. This is, of course, an increase in the artificial character of production to the extreme limits. Now comes the Great War, or to put it more cautiously, the first of the great decisive wars. Here, the degree of political foresight of the individual governments for economic matters varies greatly. The only great country that knew from the outset that this war would also have to push world economic questions to a certain solution was England. The well-known words of Edward VII that Germany had entered the circle of the great nations too late, and the other often heard that one day England would have to wage this war for the sake of the weekend, signify a very clear insight into facts that had been developing for 5 decades up to a point where, as always in the world, force was put into its place. The constantly changing methods and aims of the war all speak in favour of the only slowly growing insight into the meaning of events. If in the future a historian examines why the direct and indirect war aims changed in the course of this war, he will be astonished to realise that from one year to the next, the problem of forcibly restricting the production of the military weaker party became increasingly clear. From merely damaging the enemy in order to make him politically and military weaker, the aim is ever more consciously to render the defeated nation economically uncompetitive for as long as possible, to destroy it industrially, if possible, and the Peace of Versailles, the cession of industrial areas, the reparations, the surrender of the merchant fleet, the disarmament, strife for nothing else. It was only in the course of the World War that the great problem, not of these years, but of 2 centuries, came to the fore in all its starkness. The fact that there are too many white people in the world. I mean, I know Spengler is who he is, but it's interesting you hear that expression come from other people, but let's just say they're not of our ethnic stock, so to speak. That that these people have accumulated far too much in Europe, that the production which must feed these masses of people cannot necessarily count on sales, and that consequently a decision must one day be taken, either by forcibly reducing the population by transportation, or by regulating world production, or at last resort, by reducing the production of the one who has proved to be the weaker in the political competition and has resigned himself to this fact. There is no point in trying to close our eyes to this fact. No amount of goodwill towards understanding will eliminate it. The great problem of the next few decades is that after the unrestrained expansion of production has been the ideal of all countries, the great sober and serious question of a certain moderation or regulation, or whatever else you want to call it, is the order of the day. If the issue does not seem so urgent at the moment, we must realise that in Europe, where there are currently 6 million unemployed, we can only speak of an interlude of recovery. There's still so much to make up for in terms of things that have not been produced or have been poorly produced or have been destroyed over the years, that at the moment it is at least possible to delude ourselves about the severity of this crisis. A delusion in the long term, this will not be the case. Firstly, the monopoly of the white nations in this area was broken even before the war. The first non-European nation to appear on the world market as an independent competitor on the largest scale, backed by a strong military armament instead of remaining a consumer nation, was Japan. I do not mention the United States because it occupies a special position, although its transition from predominantly consuming European and predominantly exporting its own industrial goods has considerably aggravated the situation. But it also turns out that during the war, and even before it, the unexpectedly large coal deposits throughout the war have been used to an increasing extent to create industries that are closer to the customer than the European ones. Today, we have industrial areas in India, in Egypt, in Turkestan, in South Africa, in Canada, in Australia. There is no telling how long it will be before South America, China, and Persia join the ranks of the major industrialized countries, as everywhere else, the newly developed locations have a head start over half-exhausted locations. The question remains as to whether, in view of this abundance, coal deposits alone are sufficient to secure a state's ability to feed its population. We are moving towards an energetic utilization of coal by means of development, liquefaction, etc., which, with the increased efficiency, also means a reduced need for materials. In addition, oil and hydropower have also emerged as independent competitors on the market for natural resources. And it's also interesting because this is a point Spengler will expand on in Man in Technics, which he writes in 1931, that the West has lost its monopoly on the means of the production and industry because we've essentially, through the white man's burden, by helping raise up the coloured man, he now has access to all our technology and is now able to steadily start outcompeting us. And this is ultimately the disaster of the current West, which we're living through. Above all, however, the fact that Europe no longer possesses the former military monopoly is decisive in forcing the other continents to remain in the position of the consumer and to renounce the role of the producer. In this, I see the historically most important upheaval, which was initiated by the Russo-Japanese War and brought to a head by the World War. In contrast to the previous century, the great powers of Europe are no longer among themselves when making decisions. The coloured world has itself become a great power in Africa, in East Asia, in Islam, in Central America. This corresponds to the turning point in Roman history, when the provinces became more important than Rome. Russia, once the easternmost of the Western powers, is now the westernmost of the Eastern powers, as far as Japan, and through its ideal union with Asia, has entered into a close connection of incalculable consequences. The English dominions form an association in which one does not quite know whether its centre of gravity is still in Europe or not. Islam continues its penetration of the whole of Africa. The United States has acquired a position which is more and more likely to turn the American continent into a world of its own. These are a phenomenon that would have been unthinkable half a century ago. And it really has become a world of its own, especially with the mass influx of the third world. But again, hopefully Trump's going to reverse that. Thus, on the other hand, the fact that the economic constitution and thus the preservation of the white nations, which are now swollen to their present height, is in danger. On the other hand, the second, no less serious fact that nations outside Europe have a say in the economic policy regulation of the question. There's a third factor which must be mentioned in a few words. The form of the executive governments of the endangered nations have also changed in the course of the last decades. Big sovereign governments, in the sense that Bismarck's, Napoleon III in the beginning, and also the English government in Gladstone's time, were no longer exists today. Apart from a few dictatorships, and in all countries, the possibility of throwing the full weight of political influence, of capital, and finally of arms into the balance in order to secure or improve the existence of the nation in its absolute number, the situation is essentially dependent on whether the respective government is supported or hindered from within. As grotesque as this may seem to a future observer, the former is nothing less than self-evident. I need not go into details here. It will appear quite natural that the English people, owing to their education in the world's political factual thinking, although, as I have indicated, they've also broken up into a double nation, an industrial mass of the population, and the rest would nevertheless stand united in all questions of national importance. What we would call national today, is basically only the practical egoism of an area which is condemned by its entire economic and political development to stand or fall as a whole, which must therefore count on every individual and every class. If instead of nationalism one wanted to say healthy economic egoism, then the difference would not be very great. And the part of the people whose existence is tied to coal would certainly be the first to be motivated by this kind of selfishness, because it would be the first to suffer the consequences of losing or forfeiting the protection of the means of power of a large state. Be that as it may, if we analyse the leading countries of the world, to what extent each one could count on the support of the parties concerned in the event of a dispute over this vital question, the result would be very sad for more than one, as long as it was a question of nations and the guise of forms that had grown up and were sanctified by the power of tradition, of states as they emerged from the time of Napoleon and still stood unshaken at the time of Bismarck. The power of an individual, however undisputedly great, was limited by the mighty power of the traditional forms opposing him. This is also true, as English industry proves, of traditional customs and methods in business. As a result, a leader, whether he was a business leader, a popular leader, a diplomat, or a financier, could only assert his personal superiority within certain limits. The old state, the old economy, the old company were power in their own right. What we knew in the great confrontation that awaits us in the future, and what will be almost the only hopeful thing for Germany, are the actually unlimited creative possibilities for people who have grown beyond the measures of the others. It is probable in the future in the whole field of economics, technology, finance, as well as in politics, diplomacy and war, that again and again an individual, through the power of his personality, and thus through the greatness of his position, will outweigh all the unfavourable factors I've just mentioned. Just as I must mention the name of Mussolini here, a man from a country that can never become a world power, well, throwing shade at Italy there, Spengler, has nevertheless made something in 3 years that looks like a world power and can undoubtedly, as long as he lives, play the role of a superior power in the Mediterranean. So it is possible that even in an economic unit that has emerged from the war under the most unfavourable conditions, and in the superiority of the leading personalities will balance everything that, on the other hand, the planned destruction tactics of the new political methods aim to achieve. Again, though, he's very much defending the idea of a Caesar. Even if your country may not be a superpower, having a strong executive that actually acts in the interest can go a long way to getting some kind of sovereignty. In the course of the 20th century, I foresee a historical epoch, namely an economical historical and political historical one, in which it will be less about states and constitutions, even less about dictates and treaties, but more and more and ever more decisively about great names whose sound will raise up powers and win spiritual battles. The people who have the strongest individuals, the most unspoiled, the least bound to upright traditions, will finally and ultimately be the victors. The situation itself is, and as I have said, that the unconditional primacy of Europe has been lost, that nations of the form and number of heads which they have developed in Europe in the course of industrialization must be transformed into a new form of existence in the midst of the rest of the world in order to continue to exist. That a new kind of connection must be achieved between a European country as a centre of gravity and some kind of relations with other parts of the world as a basis, which is hardly indicated today in the English Empire or in Russia's attempt to join a circle of states in Asia. If a country does not succeed on this basis in forming a ramified system of its economic system, and that, let us not be unclear about this, relatively favourably against others who want the same, the only thing that will remain will be what has recently been proposed in England in all seriousness, namely the mass resettlement of the permanently unemployed to other parts of the world, in this case to the dominions which have immediately forbidden it. Well, what we've ended up with today is the mass unemployed of the third world have been dumped in our Western countries just to grift off on social housing and welfare. This would, of course, be a means that would succeed in not believing in the country and solving the problem, but in exacerbating it, because, as I believe I have shown, the way things have developed over the last century. 1 million people capable of working and fighting means not only productive power, but also national wealth, economic power, political and military power, and that's ultimately something that can be thrown into the balance when it comes to concluding economic agreements on an advantageous basis and enforcing compliance by the opponent. Because today, as always, only the politically stronger party is secure in contracts, including economic ones. Let me conclude, no matter how much great politics may have come under the pressure of economic management as a result of the development of the last century, no matter how much it has become dependent on it and dominated by its goals, economic success on a large scale, i.e. the economic safeguarding of the existence of a large nation, is only possible today if political power can also be placed in the balance against that which exists on the other side, power that does not consist in mass but in superiority. The path of refinement is not limited to technical processes and methods. It is a path taken by culture as a whole. I therefore repeat in conclusion, political power without which there can be no economic success in the long term no longer consists only in money, guns and treaties, but increasingly in the presence of personalities who, through their superiority, represents real power and can replace the anonymous power of large numbers. My hope for Germany is based on the fact that we are a nation that has produced the strongest individualities in technology, science and organisation, in the economy, army and administration for a century, and has obviously not yet exhausted this power of production by far. Again, Spengler being optimistic for post-World War I Germany. But I think in some way it's fortunate that he died when he did in the 1936. Otherwise, he would have lived to have seen. I mean, if he was depressed by what happened to Germany after World War I, he certainly would have, I think, been spiritually crushed by what happened after World War II. But all I can say is obviously Germany's having their election come up in a few weeks, and so it's unlikely the AfD will come to power, but hopefully they'll do well enough that they will be able to cause significant motions within the political system and finally move towards a more healthy situation for Germany. And I hope across the broader West we're able to rebuild our countries from the dire situations they're presently in. At the moment, America seems the most likely. Okay, we've not had any super chats. So thank you everybody for watching. As I said, this is the last part of the series of essays looking at this work of essays released by Imperium Press. Again, excellent reading. And so please support Imperium Press, buy their other books. In terms of in fact, there's actually a link to their edition below in the description and in the previous episodes of this if people want to look at that. You can also buy their books on Amazon, though I would recommend their site directly because you're cutting out the middleman. In terms of coming up, this Saturday we should be having Hunger back, and we're going to be doing the finale of the Chatham House version series. We'll actually be getting to the essay that is called the Chatham House version. We'll be looking at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and a critique of the worldview of Arnold Toynbee and some other British scholars. As many people will know, last Tuesday I did do a stream of Semiagog on the Anglo-American establishment, so this stream will be very much related to that conversation. And in fact, there was some of the, unfortunately, because that stream last week went on for so long, I couldn't quite get everything in I wanted from the Quigley book. So what I will be doing is I'll be bringing up some of the Quigley chapter on the Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, as well as the Kaduri essay I'll be discussing with Hunger, just to further enrich and provide some historical background to that institution, which we'll be discussing. And one other thing I want to announce is I will actually be launching channel memberships very soon on this channel if people want to support me. So what will happen is that the Chatham House series, once the final stream has been done, it will stay up for about a week. But a week later, I will then put, I think, every episode barring the very first one I did behind the paywall. So just making everybody aware of that. And I might possibly put some of the older streams on this channel, maybe some of the lesser viewed ones behind the paywall as well. The vast majority of the content going forward will be free, but that's just something to let you know if you want to support me. Because I did put a lot of work into that series, and not to say I haven't found it intellectually satisfying, and it's been great talking to Hunger. We have had one super chat, Lord Charles Thomas for €2. just thought I'd show what support I can. Well, thank you so much, Lord Charles Thomas. And, well, thank you everybody for watching, and good night. See you on Saturday.